Laurie Grun has been involved in animal issues as a writer, teacher, and activist for over 25 years, and her relationships with scholars, thinking about animals, activists, working to protect animals, and most importantly has been with many different animals, uniquely informed her perspective on how we need to rethink our engagement with other animals. Laurie is currently a professor of philosophy as well as a feminist, gender, and sexuality studies and environmental studies at Wesleyan University, where she also coordinates Wesleyan Animal Studies. Laurie has published extensively on topics in animal ethics, ecofeminism, and practical ethics more broadly. She's the author of 2 books on animal ethics and the editor of 5 books. And she's currently writing a book now exploring ethical and epistemological issues raised by human relations to captive chimpanzees.
Great. Thank you, Carol. That was really great. I have a PowerPoint that I also want to use, but I want to thank everybody for being here, and I also want to thank Sarah for the really fabulous land acknowledgement, and want to add to the land acknowledgement that she did so well that we also be aware of and paying attention to the liminal animals that are in our spaces. Will Kimlicka and Sue Donaldson have usefully identified a category of the animals that are in our presence, in our spaces, that sort of are not part of the domestic work that we're doing, but also not completely wild. And so we're interacting with all sorts of animals all the time. Often we don't know, so I want to acknowledge them before we start. The image that I'm starting with and what I want to talk about today as a philosopher are some of the theoretical ideas that we've been developing. This is Vine Sanctuary. It's an ecofeminist sanctuary for formerly farmed animals, and it's a sanctuary that I support. I think, as Mike said, I also do a lot of work with chimpanzees. I won't be talking too much about those today. What I would like to talk about today is what I call entangled empathy. And Carol was just talking to us about reproductive rights. And what I want to sort of identify is some of the problems that we think exist within theoretical understanding of rights. So I think we need to move away from rights as a concept, although I recognize that we're deeply steeped in a rights tradition all over the world. And so I'm not suggesting that somehow that's bad or that shouldn't be done. But I want to sort of suggest that there is another way of thinking about how we might approach our relationships with each other and our relationships with other animals. And part of what I want to suggest is that there has been a long and interesting discussion about both an ethics of justice and an ethics of care. And there's misconceptions, and I've been recently reminded of these misconceptions at 2 conferences, so I wanted to mention those first. And then I want to highlight the ways in which focusing on empathy captures what I take to be a much more progressive way of understanding the relationships that we're in, and I'll say why. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I'm calling entangled empathy, distinguish that from sympathy, and then talk about some of the pitfalls or dangers associated with entangled empathy and try to answer how we might overcome those difficulties or pitfalls. But before I get there, let me just try to say a little bit about this difference between a rights-based approach or a justice approach and a care-based approach or an empathy-based approach. So often, because of the early history of, it's not that early, in maybe 30, 40 years ago, but that history of the articulation of an ethics of justice versus an ethics of care, that division tended to be gendered. And the idea was that men are concerned about justice and women are concerned about care. But that's actually a mistake, I think, although it gets discussed fairly regularly. What the difference is really about is a difference between a focus on individualism in the ethics of justice case and a focus on relationality in the ethics of care case. a focus on abstraction and generality in the case of ethics of justice, and particularity, and that's partly why I use this slide here, and particularity as opposed to generality or abstraction in the case of an ethics of care. And also in the case of justice, we have things that are pronouncements and judgments and assessments that are meant to be universal, and in a more empathetic or care-based or ecofeminist way of thinking, what we're paying attention to is context. And so the idea then is that when you're interested in thinking about individuals and individualism in the abstract and in a universal sense, what ends up happening is you end up overlooking important differences, differences that also lead themselves to, in both a liberal and a neoliberal context, all sorts of oppression. And so one of the reasons I think that it's more both ethically and politically compelling to work for on a more care or empathy-based ethics is because it seems that some of the real problems that we face in terms of exploitation and oppression have to do with in large part, the grounding that comes through the liberal basis for rights. And so that's part of why I think that we need to move away from rights talk and instead develop what I call entangled empathy, or an empathetic engagement with each other and the more than human world. So what I think important in trying to understand what that would mean, what that would look like, what empathy and entangled empathy is about, is to make a distinction between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is, and these often get used in different ways, and so I'm just clarifying here that this is what I mean when I'm thinking about empathy. So sympathy is often the idea that you feel sorry for someone else, or you maybe pity them. But it doesn't actually require a full understanding of what is the trouble or the problem or what the other's going through, to use what Carol said. Whereas empathy involves the ability to put oneself in the place of the other and to try to understand how the world looks to that other. And part of what's really, I think, important about developing the skill of empathy, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment, is that that's the kind of skill that helps us to really try to sensitively navigate difference. Sympathy can allow us to maintain our distance and our difference, sort of keep difference at bay. And empathy tries to allow us, the skills that are associated with good empathetic engagement with another helps us to bridge various differences, whether that's differences in privilege, differences in gender expression, differences in sort of animal embodiment. So empathy can do that. Now, a couple more specific ways in which empathy, and what I'm calling entangled empathy, helps us to move across that difference is, first, the reason I use the notion of entanglement is that entanglement entails that we're already in relation, and we are in these relations that already exist. We're not creating new relations. We're already in the relations. So the focus then becomes not, well, which relationship should I be in, but rather, how can I make this relationship that I'm already in better? And so the entangled part of the empathy suggests that these are not sort of moment by moment things, but because of various kinds of limitations on the material existence and the means of existence, as well as the ways in which all sorts of political and market assemblages operate, we end up in these complex relationships with others. And so what the entanglement idea does is helps us to sort of reconceive of our activities and our actions as already being in relation and how to make those better. Now, the conditions for entangled empathy, I suggest, is that we have a self-other distinction. And part of what that means is that if we don't recognize that we are distinct from others, then what ends up happening is, and I'll get to this in a minute, we might end up sort of unable to fully grasp the perspective of the other from their point of view. We also need to develop skills to take the perspective of others and to also become more aware of another's interests. And the combination of all these things actually has a motivating feature. That is, once we are able to recognize ourselves as distinct from another, but at the same time take the perspective of the other, then we are often going to be moved to act to better their situation. I also wanted to highlight, because there's a lot of confusion here, that empathy is not just mere emotional contagion. It is a developed skill that requires a lot of cognitive and rational engagement. So it's not just a instinct or an emotional contagion. Emotional contagion is this idea that we've all sort of heard and seen about yawning when somebody yawns, and then other people start to yawn, and it's not very cognitive, it's just sort of reactive. But entangled empathy is not that. It's not just a sort of nurturing or caring reaction at all. It's also importantly not about a precursor to moral judgment. It's not the kind of thing in which one is entering into sort of a conception of praise and blame. And in this way, it's still very linked up with compassion, feeling with. But it's not mere feeling with, but it's engaged in sort of what you're trying to do is not first or immediately judge, but rather to see what, as Carol said it as well, see what the others might be going through and try to understand what the other is going through, not from one's own perspective, but from the perspective of the individual who's going through it. And it's also important that there's critical attention paid to the context under which the well-being or the flourishing of others is threatened. And this is important for a variety of reasons, because sometimes there can be a way in which you're feeling with another to try to manipulate the other or to take advantage of the other. And entangled empathy specifically has the notion of improving the well-being of all. So part of what I think is also important to highlight about this notion of entangled empathy is that it helps us to develop a certain way of seeing the world. So we are changed ourselves when we're engaged in this kind of empathetic perception of others. And when we pay attention to the particularities of the lived experience of others, and here I'm just talking about other animals, but this applies across human animals as well. So the idea here is that one of the things that we want to be attending to and perceiving well is the species typical behaviors and the desires and the interests and the needs of others. We want to try to develop understanding of what Jakob van Uxel called the Umwelt, which is the sort of worldview of the others, and to try to see how that might look from their perspective. I often have my students try to imagine and exercise for trying to figure out what it is that the world might look like if you're a polar bear or if you're a whale. It's not an easy thing to do. And so one of the ways that one gets better at doing this is by studying animals in their more or less natural environments, and also reflecting on those that do study animals in their natural environments. And also paying, I think, important critical attention to the larger conditions that undermine the well-being and flourishing of animals. And here I would like to evoke our dear friend and who passed away, Marty Keel, who was one of the real founders of ecofeminism. She brought to our attention this notion that when we're thinking about how to act and what ethics entails, we often just sort of look at the situation as it now exists, and we fail to recognize that that's a truncated narrative, that actually what we should be attending to is how we got into this situation, the larger, broader context. How did we get into this situation in the first place? And so it might be that if we're going to act to engage, what we want to do is not just fix an immediate situation, but actually look at the larger structures and the larger context that might have led to the crisis in the first instance. So that's a little bit about how I'm understanding entangled empathy. I just want to raise a few common objections that I've heard and that you might have in your mind. So one of the worries, and this is always a worry, that brings people back to the strength of a rights-based approach, and that is that we might just be engaged in a certain kind of projection, that we're just unable really to take the perspective of another. And so when we say that we're empathizing, really all we're doing is taking our own desires and interests and glossing them onto another. But I think it's important to recognize that empathy is a process. So you go back and forth between your perspective and the perspective of another. And that's why the self-other distinction is so important. Because if you're checking yourself through the second personal approach against what you're perceiving of another, you can really, I think, through practice and skill and development of this skill, you can really change it from being simply about you and being more about the relationship the other might have. And also, of course, paying attention to context is also really super helpful here. There's also, and this is the empathetic torture example gets brought up, and this is the manipulator. And this is why I think it's so important that one of the conditions of entangled empathy is that it is geared towards promotion of well-being and flourishing. So yes, you can empathize in a cognitive and sort of way with another individual so that you can manipulate them or so that you can become a better torturer or victimizer. And certainly that has happened, and that is a problem with certain forms of empathy. But I think that if the conception that I'm trying to express in terms of entangled empathy, that's not successful entangled empathy. Another criticism that I've heard, oh, sorry, those numbers are so weird. I just realized those numbers are 1, 1, and 2, which should be 1, 2, and 3. Another criticism is this criticism of the self-other distinction. And I think that oftentimes the reason people are worried about the self-other distinction is because there is a sense that the self is more important than the other, and certainly that's been our understanding of how the category of the other gets constructed by strengthening and revaluing and giving a greater value to the self. But I don't think that the self-other distinction necessitates a value dualism. And so I think that's important to recognize, that the self and the other can simply be differently situated. They're not necessarily differently valued. And I think also, and this is something that is really important from the struggles of early feminism, the struggles of LGBT activism, and particularly now trans activism, the struggles of the anti-settler colonialism and certainly anti-racism work, is that it really does amount to a certain kind of achievement to develop a self in the context in which that self is denied. And so it's important, I think, not to move to a place where the self becomes this sort of universal whole, because that's giving up the self and blending the self with with everything. This is something that happens in deep ecological work early on. Tends to sort of only happen when you're privileged enough to sort of recognize yourself as yourself, whereas the history of sort of lots of political struggle indicates that to achieve that the struggle for recognition is an achievement, and we shouldn't just throw that away. And I think that the self-other dualism shouldn't be recognized as a value dualism, and that is an objection, but we can have a recognition that we're also co-constituted in our self-other categorization. Okay, so I also wanted, so those are objections that I think I've answered. Maybe you guys will come up with some other objections, and I'd really love to talk about them. But I want to also just talk about the ways in which now, the ways in which our own empathetic entangled empathy can go wrong. So not an objection to the idea of and the structure of entangled empathy, but objections to or recognition of the errors or failures that we might make when we're engaged in entangled empathy. And I call these empathetic failures, and I see them as having two different versions. There's an epistemic version and an ethical version. And I think the epistemic versions of empathetic failure are often easier to correct, whereas the ethical versions of empathetic failure are a little bit more tricky. So let me just say a little bit about each of those. So the epistemic failures occur when one can over-empathize with the plight of another. And what I have in mind here is this idea that we get ourselves a little bit too involved in a particular kind of context of oppression and fail to recognize the full nature of the experience of the other. So if we imagine ourselves as being let's say, really concerned about a particular form of racism, what we might do if we were overemphasizing is imagine that the victim of racism is suffering from the weight of racial oppression and racial discrimination. And we can sometimes fail to recognize that even within oppression and even within conditions of sort of extreme hardship, there still might be sort of marvelous things happening. And so what happens when we overemphasize is we're sort of unable to recognize the full nature of the experience of the other. And so a way of correcting that particular kind of failure is to sort of develop greater self-knowledge and to try to understand the other better. And this is just a little aside, I teach in a maximum security men's prison, and it's obviously in the United States, there's a disproportionate number of African American men in this prison, and oftentimes the writing tutors and teaching assistants that I bring in with me to the prison engage in a certain kind of overemphasizing with the racism that is clearly a part of the carceral state here. And so it's a process of trying to sort of correct that particular kind of over-empathy by gaining greater self-knowledge, recognizing one's doing that, recognizing one's commitment to anti-racism and anti-racist work is not going to be the kind of thing that should occlude or prevent one from recognizing sort of a variety of experiences, even within a racist carceral system. Okay, so that's a problem. The much bigger epistemic problem, though, I see is incomplete empathizing, where people are just basically unable to see others for living their full lives in the way that they are. And a lot of times, I think in the case of non-human animals, that's what's happening. We just don't understand. So more information, and by information, I don't mean something sort of clearly non-contestable, but just trying to learn more can help us with these epistemic failures. Now, with ethical failures, I just want to sort of suggest that there are 3 ways that we can sort of have inapt empathy. One is effective ignorance, and that is a term that was coined by Michelle Moody Adams. And Michelle Moody Adams suggested that oftentimes we could say, well, I just don't know enough, so didn't I just need more information? This is just an epistemic problem. I don't know enough. But there's an important sense in which we're also responsible for knowing and what we know. And that's also, again, why I thought the land acknowledgement that Sarah gave at the beginning was very important, and I think it's so important to think about all of the animals that we are involved in harming unintentionally, that we also sort of recognize that, we not be ignorant of that in a way that we should be acknowledging that. One of the things that I've been arguing in the book that Carol and I mentioned, I talk about the ways in which it's so important to see that even as vegans and anti-oppression activists and scholars, we are also involved in the death of so many others and the distress of so many others, and to not acknowledge that when you're clearly able to and can acknowledge that is a version of affected ignorance. So that's a failure that needs to be corrected. And the other idea is that we sometimes have empathetic bias. And I see this a lot in various social justice movements, and so I just want to flag it as something to pay attention to. And so the idea is that we need to recognize that we can be biased in favor of one particular form of oppression and empathize with the beings that we're in relationship with vis-a-vis that lens of oppression. But the problem is that that can maybe bias us to other lenses, and we can talk a little bit more about that. And the other is empathetic overload, and this is something I think is really important, and again gets to sorry, can everybody? Okay, I'm hoping you can hear me. The other is empathetic overload, and I just want to suggest that this is a really important thing for activists to be attentive to, because given that we are in these relations and we care so much about the well-being of others, it's oftentimes very, very difficult to not burn out. And I think the self-care that Sarah talked about at the beginning is a really important way of trying to avoid empathetic overload, to recognize what one's limits are. And also, empathetic overload can happen in the context in which one is on the front line of care work. And I think that oftentimes what can happen is one can have to shut off their engagement with empathy to, as my friend and colleague Patrice Jones puts it, to not be alive to the feelings of the other because one is so overcome with sort of the demands of the interests of others. And so that's something that's really going to takes a lot of work. And so I will just end by saying this is the kind of work that one needs to try to engage in. These are the skills that I think we need in order to become better at entangled empathetic engagement. Patience, which is, I know, very difficult in an age of such horrifying atrocities and oppression. Courage, the courage to be able to face it and also to be able to accept one's mistakes. Self-reflection is obviously a hugely important part of any way of making one's relationship better. And again, my idea is that entangled empathy is about making our relationships with others better. And self-reflection is obviously important. And humility. I think this is something that is something that often in our struggles we fail to acknowledge, and I encourage that we all sort of call each other out to try to maintain humility. And I'm really sorry that this audio is hard. I hope you were able to hear at least most of what I had to say. Thanks. Okay, so the question is a question about how, it's a great question. It's a question about how we, studying emotions and behavior scientifically, but science has traditionally been about maintaining so-called, hard to do, objectivity and avoiding emotion. And I think that's to some extent true, and it's to some extent not. So I think if you think back in the work, 50 years of work that Jane Goodall has done, the work of scientists like Mark Bekoff and Lori Marino, and others, it seems that compassion is a really important part of the work that they're doing, and they do recognize the individual as well as the individual's relationships to others. And one of the, actually, interestingly, one of the ways that I got to thinking about this problem of inappropriate or inapt empathy had to do with the way a particular animal rights organization thought it would be best to treat chimpanzees, and failing to understand what a chimpanzee is in need of over their ideology of not interfering. And these were captive chimpanzees, so it was a little bit problematic. And so scientists who work with chimpanzees, for example, I think have a very deep, compassionate understanding. Not all scientists, of course, not those who are doing biomedical research, but those who are doing behavioral research have a very deep, compassionate understanding, often, not always. The question about how to make science more compassionate is, and I think you're right, it would be more accurate if it were more compassionate, is a pretty significant problem. And I think, unfortunately, this is a large question, but the way that we're understanding other animals by way of imaging their brains, for example, is, in my view, that's not going to get us going in the right direction. And sadly, because my work is on empathy, a lot of people think that this mirror neuron work is related to what I do, but I actually don't think it is at all. I think it's actually another construct that's somewhat reductionist and fails to understand the full nature of the relationships that we're in with others and how our emotion and reason work together. I hope that answers the question. It's a big question.